All right, hello. My name is Wendy Chisholm. I'm from the AI for Accessibility program. I'm excited to virtually be joining you today. And I'm excited to hear what comes out of the projects that you're working on and the hackathon that you're doing. And so I'm just excited to talk with you about the AI for Accessibility program and what we're looking for and what we're hoping for. So let's get started. One of the exciting things about accessibility and designing for people with disabilities is that it's a really great way to create innovative new ideas. And we've seen this through the history of innovation, that accessible technology has the potential to drive innovation with more intuitive and personal experiences. And so let me walk you through a few of those. One of the cool things about working with people with disabilities and making sure that your products and your projects work is that we're kind of leaps and bounds ahead of what other people are doing. So a lot of people right now are using voice recognition or speech output. But these are things that people in the disability communities have been using for decades. So for example, someone who is driving in their car has a hands-free, eyes-free experience, right? As you're driving, your eyes need to be on the road. Your hand needs to be on the wheel. Well, people who are blind or have low vision are used to not seeing the computer. And so they've been using speech output to access their computer for decades. IBM came up with one of the first screen readers in the 80s. And so we can see this in a lot of different ways. And what's exciting is that as our technology infuses our environment more and more, it's making those environments more accessible to more people. And so one of my favorite quotes is, it's the stairs that make the building inaccessible, not the wheelchair. And so really what that means is how we design things is what makes the world have barriers or makes it more inclusive. And so the design decisions that you're making in your hackathon projects and in your products that you develop for your companies, those are the decisions that are really going to make the world more inclusive, hopefully. And AI, which is what I'm really here to talk about today, is allowing us to innovate even quicker and with more people and in more situations. So the fact that technology can help us understand each other, it can help us understand our location. And another thing I wanted to share too is that we all use word prediction on our phones. And that's another technology that was developed a long time ago for people who physically can't use their hands to type. There are many different ways that people with disabilities use computers. And so when you look at those technologies and then the technologies designed around them, you're going to find so many cool innovations. And that's now what we're all using. In noisy environments, having captions, or you're probably looking at captions right now of me speaking. And so again, captions, those visualizations of words are what people who are deaf have been using to access audio content for a very long time. So it's just an exciting area to be an engineer in, because not only can you can just design things that are innovative. You have so many more opportunities to just be creative. And in particular, AI can do these things, or it's starting to do these things, right? In some cases, AI can perceive and learn and reason, which can extend all of our capabilities. So we have image recognition, but I also want to caution on some of the issues with image recognition, and you'll hear more about this, that our AI is only as good as the data it's built on. And if we don't include everyone in the development and in those data sets, we will perpetuate the bias that creates barriers and exclusion. So we have to be careful with our technologies because, as I said, it's those stairs that make the building inaccessible. We want to make sure that our AI and the digital products we create aren't stairs of the future, but maybe we can look at them being curb cuts, which is a way to make sidewalks more accessible for people who use wheelchairs. So what I'd like to do is dig into the AI for Accessibility program. It's one of 5 AI for Good programs that Microsoft has. AI for Earth was one of the first of these projects. AI for Accessibility was the second. We've been around for about 3 years. But there's also AI for Humanitarian Action, AI for Cultural Heritage, and AI for Health. So we've got a lot of these projects where we're showing how AI can be empowering for people and problems. So AI for Accessibility is a 5-year, $25 million program. And what we're doing is we really want to accelerate these innovations. And it's really an exciting thing to do. And we do that in a few different ways. We have grants of technology, for example, Azure credits. We share knowledge in that we have a data science team. We have other Azure partners that we can pull in. And we really see this as a partnership with our grantees. We, throughout the life of a grant, we work with our grantees every month to help make sure that if there's any blockers, we can move those aside. If there's any introductions people need to engineers or other partners, we want to make sure that people are getting the access they need to be successful. We also see this as a partnership with disability communities because we really believe in the adage, nothing about us without us. And so the way that innovation can happen in this space is by partnering. And ideally, that we're finding projects that are developed with or by people with disabilities themselves, not necessarily developed for people with disabilities. And the reason that's important is that a lot of people are very inspired by using AI and inspired by using technology, and they want to help make the world a better place. Unfortunately, sometimes people don't always get it right. And so an example of that would be sign language gloves. So sign language, which is what people who can't hear may use, it's speaking with your hands, it's a visual language. And it is not just your hands, but it includes your face, your body. There's a lot of movement to it. And there are sign languages and sign language variations and dialects all over the world, just as there is with spoken language. There's English and Korean, but there's also several types of sign language: English Sign Language, American Sign Language, British Sign Language, and then I'm not sure how many variations of Korean Sign Language there are. So it's a language. So there's 2 aspects needed. There's not only picking up all the physical movements, but there's also making that translation from one language to another, just as we would translate from English to Korean. So we see these sign language gloves, and they're not a good solution. And part of that is because I think people they aren't really connected with the community in terms of what they need. So anyway, I'll talk more about that a little bit later about how complex that problem is. But that partnership piece, there's a lot of aspects to that I want to make sure people understand. And as I said, the types of grants, we kind of have 2. One is where we give credits and cash so that people can build on Azure. And the other is where we pull in some more of our engineering resources, that data science team and the Azure enablement team. And so these are kind of what's available. Now we are granting applications in 3 focus areas, and I'm going to go into each of these a bit more and show you some of our example grantees. The focus areas are employment, daily life, and communication and connection. And so first off, let's look at employment. Now, employment is important because when you look across the world, people with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed than people without a disability. And so in some cases, in the US, for example, and this was before COVID, we don't know how COVID has impacted people with disabilities, but we're anticipating it will be even more disastrous than it's been for the general population. So these numbers are pre-COVID, but pre-pandemic in the US, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is about 81%, which is more than double that of people without a disability. And again, those numbers have shifted significantly due to the pandemic. When we look at other countries as well, we see similar numbers. In Brazil, for example, the unemployment rate was 76%. And so this is a huge number. And there are so many reasons why this happens. And one of the biggest issues is bias. And I think this is where we're learning a lot from some of our grantees. And I'll share that in a moment. The opportunity here is to really help people develop skills, to evolve the culture in inclusive hiring, and really helping show people what's possible. So a lot of those recommendation engines, let's ensure that they are robust enough to handle the variations that come with disability. So for example, one of our projects is our ability. This is a picture of John Robinson. He's the CEO, and it's been so great working with him. His personal story really exemplifies what it is that we're trying to shift, or that what ideally will shift in the employment space for people with disabilities. So I'm going to paraphrase his story, and it's so much better when he tells it. So maybe in the comments afterward, I can link to some of the YouTube videos that he has. He's a really good speaker. But basically, his journey is that he went to a top-rate university in the United States. He had the same grades and the same experience as many of his peers. And when they all graduated, several of them very easily got jobs, and it took him much longer. I think it took him 6 years longer to get his first job in broadcast TV. And this is a common scenario that it's just far too common that we hear. He also tells some stories of some students he's worked with where a guidance counselor may guide someone with a disability, a student with a disability, into a lower job than what they can do, right? A lower skill job. And we've seen this in the statistics in the United States. I've not looked, I'm not as sure about other countries, but actually I know this happens in India as well, that people with disabilities tend to be guided into some of the same types of jobs over and over. For example, retail, and I can't think of the other ones right now, but what we're trying to do is diversify where people are getting employment and ensuring that the jobs people are going into are jobs that have advancement, so that someone doesn't get stuck just being a salesperson or something like that. And that's a great job, but we want to ensure that if someone really has a dream, that there are a lot of ways that we can do that, right? And how can AI help with that? And one of the things that John's doing, he's doing two things that are really neat. One is that he's created a chatbot that is fully accessible. And that's interesting because when you look at chatbots, they aren't always good with voice input into the chatbot. Siri and some of the things on our phone do that, but some of the chatbots that are on the web don't always do that so well. And so he's really making sure that no matter your ability, no matter your disability, no matter how you interact with the computer, you can interact with this chatbot. The other thing is in the data that they're collecting, they're collecting different data than, say, LinkedIn would collect. And part of that is going to allow a richer type of recommendation. So not only can we recommend jobs to people, but we can start making recommendations for careers based on interest and really helping people overcome some of the bias that is in the current hiring process. So I'm really excited about the work that John is doing. A second project is at the Frist Center for Autism. They are creating a variety of tools that will help people with autism kind of practice job interviews and giving feedback and working with these avatars to kind of practice. The flip side of that is the potential to allow people who are doing interviews to practice interviewing someone with autism so that there isn't this immediate, oh, you're not making eye contact with me, therefore, I don't trust what you're saying. So there's this helping those conversations both ways can be really interesting to look at. So they're doing some good work too. Now I'll move on to our second focus area, which is daily life. And this is a large area. It covers a few different things. So I'm just going to highlight two aspects of it. One of that is the access to assistive technology. And right now, about 1 in 10 people worldwide have access to the technology they need. And if you're not familiar with assistive technology, there's a lot out there. And so I'll just give you a quick primer. If you are blind or have low vision, and the other thing I also want to make sure is that people often have multiple disabilities. So you might be using mixtures of these technologies depending on your abilities. And so this is also why AI is interesting, because there's the potential to personalize any of these tools based on your preferences, based on your ability, based on your usage. That's another thing that's really exciting about AI is that personalization aspect, because that's one of the reasons why the staircase causes disability, right? In that metaphor, design causes disability because we design for kind of the average. An average, we inevitably lose the ends of the spectrum by designing for average. So personalization allows us to get a broader coverage in how we're doing design. But anyway, assistive technologies. Screen readers will read a screen aloud to someone who can't see the screen. Screen magnifiers will magnify the screen for someone who has low vision. We have captions, as I mentioned before. We have audio descriptions. That's something that's used in video that will describe the visual information for someone who can't see a video. There's a bunch of different ways that people who can't type can access, whether that's voice input, whether it's a sip and puff, which is a way to control the computer through your mouth. Gosh, there's a whole bunch. I guess I'm not going to go through everything, but just to give you a flavor. And the problem is that oftentimes these technologies are very expensive. Now, more and more, these technologies are being built into our devices. So we have screen readers, we have speech output, we have speech input in our phones and our computers, but even that can be really expensive for people. So what are other ways that we can make these technologies more accessible, making the assistive technologies even more accessible? And another aspect that doesn't get discussed enough, and actually let me take a step back and say that we look at 6 categories of disability. As I said, people may fall into multiple categories, but broadly speaking, there's visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, cognitive disabilities, neurodiversity, speech disabilities, physical disabilities, and mental health conditions. And so the mental health conditions we just had a request for proposals in March. And part of that was we hadn't been getting any proposals and we hadn't funded any projects that focused on mental health. So we had a request for proposals. We had a really great response and we funded 3 projects. And you can learn more about those on our website. We have both a blog and we can point to those projects. And we continue to fund and look for projects in this area. And the reason for that is that in some countries, there may be only 1 mental health worker per 100,000 people. And again, mental health is something that has really, the dialogue around that has shifted so much with the pandemic. It's been interesting. I personally live with a mental health condition, and it's interesting for me to see how the stigma around having a mental health condition is really shifting. And part of that is because more people are talking about this. More people are experiencing mental health crises. And so it's too bad that it took a pandemic for that awareness to build. And I'm thankful that more people are aware, because there's a lot of people who need support and who aren't getting it. And one thing that AI can do, and I know people may wonder, what can you do? One of the things that's really interesting, we have a project out of Georgia Tech who's working with an organization called Befrienders in India. And for some folks who are not in crisis, connecting them with a peer to get that support is a really good step. The interesting thing is that in India, you have so many languages that are spoken and many other factors. And so trying to match people so that you have someone speaks the same language, who has a similar lived experience. There's a lot of pieces here that goes into this recommendation engine that they're working on. But until we build capacity, what are some innovative things we can do in this area? And I'm really excited about some of the projects, the projects that we funded and the projects that we're investigating. And so the challenge really in daily life is just, I think one of the most interesting things is personalization and how to do that well. And we really, again, have the opportunity to partner with people with disabilities to build technology with, or ideally fund people with disabilities to build these technologies themselves. So I'm going to focus again on a couple projects here. We have Massachusetts Eye and Ear, and unfortunately the examples I've chosen are mostly all United States. We are a global program, and I am hoping to get more projects outside of the United States. So I'm hoping that we'll get some good projects here out of Korea. But anyway, one of the things that this project recognized is that GPS is great for navigating you close to where you want to go. But if you're someone who's blind, it can't navigate you to where the bus stops, to the actual sign where the bus stop exists. And one of the interesting things about the image data sets that are out there is that most all those image data sets are photos that are taken by people who see well. And what we've learned is that when you create a technology for someone who's blind and they start using it, it often doesn't work for them, even though it may work for someone who's sighted. And the reason for that is that the photos and the images captured by people who are blind may not be centered, they may be blurry, there may be some other issues there. So one of the things that folks have been looking at, one of the folks that they looked at is just taking all these photos of actual bus stops so that as someone is scanning an area, they'll locate where the sign is and then be able to get guided to where the actual bus stop is. It's kind of, it's solving the last 30 feet problem. What's great is they've done this in 12 metropolitan cities. These are not just US cities, actually. There's several in Europe, and I'm not sure about Asia. But it's a really exciting project. And there are many of these. When we look at computer vision, there's so much data still that needs to be collected. And I'm not sure, hopefully you've heard about Seeing AI. This is one of the biggest projects out of Microsoft. This came before the AI for Accessibility program, but it continues. What the most recent work on this is collecting images of currency. I think Seeing AI in the way that it's used for currency is that if someone who is blind needs to know, do I have a dollar bill or a $5 bill, there aren't always tactile indicators on the money itself as to what denomination it is. And so you can use Seeing AI, you can point your camera, your phone at the bill, and it can voice out loud what it is. And I think they only support a few currencies. And so the current challenge is to collect photos of money from more places. And Seeing AI, I think now works in something like 30 languages, which is exciting. And I've loved seeing this one at work. I've been out at a conference with a friend who's blind, and he's read the menu. And there's some really great videos of this online as well. There's one of Satya Nadella, our CEO, with Ann Taylor from our team. And finally, again, talking about how much work, this work is continuing in terms of extending the current image data sets and also extending how to describe those images to people. And so we funded some really exciting work at the University of Texas. Donna Gurari she created one of the original data sets and is extending that work. So she's doing some really exciting stuff. We're really proud of the work she's doing. Okay, I told you daily life was a big area. This is now our third focus area. It's communication and connection. And communication, I mean, gosh, it's just essential to everything we do. Employment, shopping, family, just all aspects of connection. Communication comes up in a variety of ways. And so how can we provide more access to people? I've talked about speech recognition and speech output. I think you've seen probably Stephen Hawking, who is a physicist who used speech output when he could no longer use his mouth. But there's so many different ways that we can support communication and connection. So one of them, Zyrobotics. So this is a program that helps students with literacy, and in particular, students with learning disabilities could interact with the books, and they could speak what they're hearing and get some feedback on that. The challenge is that even there, with non-typical speech, and especially with speech patterns with children, many of the speech recognizers have some issues. They're not as accurate as they are for adults with typical speech patterns. Microsoft Translator is another one that's been really great. Again, this wasn't an AI for Accessibility project, but it's a really good example of how many different ways translation can show up and help in products. And that this is one thing that was, again, designed for one audience, but built for many, which is kind of the mantra of inclusive design at Microsoft. And finally, I mentioned sign language earlier, and a couple years ago, our program brought together all the smartest people working in sign language translation and just talked about it for 2 days and about how complex the issue is and how to make progress on it. And so the learnings from this won a Best Paper Award, which we're really proud of, and is really helping us to know and understand how complex this issue is and what ideas need to be considered moving forward. So if you are interested in sign language and AI, I really encourage you to read this paper. And yeah, ask any questions about it. So what's coming up? We just had our application round close on July 30th, and our next one is coming up. We just last week issued our next call for proposals, which are specific to cities and transportation. That deadline is December 15th. After that, our next deadline is March 12th, and that call will be focused on education. And some more details will come about, we will publish more details as we get closer to that March 12th deadline. And I know one of the questions I get most often is, how do we decide which projects get funded? And unfortunately, we do say no more than we say yes. And part of that is because we take that partnership with our grantees very seriously. And so we only have capacity to support so many people. So we really think there's a pretty lengthy process that folks go through before we issue grants. But we have some specific criteria that we look for that all applications are judged against. First, it's just how rooted in the community is it? How have you validated that this is an issue that people with disabilities really want fixed, and is this the right solution for it? As I've talked about this whole talk, when you get that right, that's where you innovate. And that one of the best ways to do that is to develop with or by people with disabilities. The second criteria would be relevance. So is it actually using AI? Our program title is AI for Accessibility. So it does need to use AI or machine learning, and it needs to be built on Azure. The impact is so important. It goes back to that rootedness in the community, and it really needs to elevate and empower people with disabilities in one of our focus areas: employment, daily life, or communication and connection. The data, right? You can't have AI without data. And so either you need to have a good data set ready to go, or you need a really compelling plan for how you're going to get data. And ideally, you'll be willing to share that data as an open data set if it makes sense, right? If there are any privacy issues, we don't expect that to be shared, but where we can, our goal is to elevate the industry and the experiences for everybody, not just Microsoft. And so by sharing that data, we can help level up the whole community. One of the stories that we just published was a blog post about the data desert. And I encourage you to read that to understand how much data we're missing and how hard it can be to do AI in this space. Next criteria is feasible and sustainable. These grants are one-year grants. And so even if you have a longer-term vision, give us what can be accomplished in 1 year. And capabilities. We need to find teams that have the skills and the knowledge to develop what we're looking for, or to develop the concept they came up with. That said, if you have a really stellar concept and a really great data set, but you may not have all the data science or AI chops, we've got a data science team. And so we can help pair people with folks to do some of that work if the impact is really innovative. And finally, we're looking for showcase stories. And the reason for that is that we know that storytelling can really shift people's awareness, especially when it comes to bias against people with disabilities, but also where it comes to opportunities of how AI can be applied. So can we tell a story that some nonprofit hears and realizes, this is how I can use AI? Or can we, reach that engineer who has a really good sense of how to do these things that other folks haven't been able to figure out? So those stories really help us extend the reach of making the world more accessible for people with disabilities. So this brings me to what our vision is, right? Microsoft's motto is to empower every person and organization to do more. And we take that a little bit further to say we want to see a world in which every person on the planet, and there's 1 billion people on the planet with a disability, is empowered to achieve more regardless of how they communicate, see, hear, or move, or feel, so that we're really making the world more inclusive. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. I hope to see some AI for accessibility applications that come out of the work that you're doing. And I just really encourage you to make sure that you're rooted in the community, that you are developing with or by people with disabilities, and that you're making the world a better place. So you can always learn more about the program at microsoft.com/AI for accessibility. Thank you so much.